Chapter 5. I looked around. We were on a high balcony at the end of a long, narrow room. In front of us, windows rose to the ceiling, and it was evident that the floor of the room was about 20 feet below ground level. Outside, I could see the barbecue still going on, but not a murmur of noise penetrated to us. What seemed to be the judge's bench was against the outside wall, under the tall windows. To the right of it was a railed stand with a chair in it, and in front, arranged in U shape, were 3 tables at which a number of men were hastily conferring. There were 9 judges in a row on the bench, all in black gowns. The spectator seats below were filled with people, and there were quite a few up here on the balcony. "What is this? Supreme Court?" I asked as Gale piloted me to a couple of seats where we could be alone. "No. Court of Political Justice," she told me. "This is the court that's going to try those 3 Bonney brothers who killed Mr. Cumshaw." It suddenly occurred to me that this was the first time I had heard anything specific about the death of my predecessor. "That isn't the trial that's going on now, I hope." "Oh, no. That won't be for a couple of days, not till after you can arrange to attend. I don't know what this trial is. I only got home today myself." "What's the procedure here?" I wanted to know. "Well, those 9 men are judges," she began. "The one in the middle is President Judge Nelson. You've met his son, the ranger officer who chased you from the spaceport. He's a regular jurist. The other 8 are prominent citizens who are drawn from a panel like a jury. The men at the table on the left are the prosecution, friends of the politician who was killed. And the ones on the right are the defense. They'll try to prove that the dead man got what was coming to him. The ones in the middle are friends of the court. They're just anybody who has any interest in the case, people who want to get some point of law cleared up, or see some precedent established, or something like that." "You seem to assume that this is a homicide case," I mentioned. "They generally are. Sometimes mayhem, or wounding, or simple assault, but there had been some sort of conference going on in the open space of floor between the judge's bench and the 3 tables. It broke up now, and the judge in the middle rapped with his gavel. "Are you gentlemen ready?" he asked. "All right, then. Court of Political Justice of the Confederate Continents of New Texas is now in session. Case of the friends of S. Austin Maverick, deceased, laid at James Bowie Continent, versus Wilbur Whately." "My God, did somebody finally kill Os Maverick?" Gale whispered. On the center table, in front of the friends of the court, both sides seemed to have piled their exhibits. Among the litter I saw some torn clothing, a big white sombrero covered with blood, and a long machete. "The general nature of the case," the judge was saying, "is that the defendant, Wilbur Whately of Sam Houston Continent, is here charged with diverse offenses arising from the death of the Honorable S. Austin Maverick, whom he killed on the front steps of the Legislative Assembly building here in New Austin." "What goes on here?" I thought angrily. "This is the rankest instance of a prejudge case I've ever seen." I started to say as much to Gale, but she hushed me. "I want to hear the specifications," she said. A man at the prosecution table had risen. "Please the court," he began. "The defendant, Wilbur Whately, is here charged with political irresponsibility and excessive atrocity in exercising his constitutional right of criticism of a practicing politician. The specifications are as follows: that on the afternoon of May 7th, Anno Domini 2193, the defendant here present did arm himself with a machete, said machete not being one of his normal and accustomed weapons, and did loiter in wait on the front steps of the Legislative Assembly building in the city of New Austin, continent of Sam Houston, and did approach the decedent, addressing himself in abusive, obscene, and indecent language, and did set upon and attack him with the machete aforesaid, causing the said decedent, S. Austin Maverick, to die." The court wanted to know how the defendant would plead. Somebody, without bother to rise, said, "Not guilty, Your Honor," from the defense table. There was a brief scraping of chairs. 4 or 5 men from the defense and the prosecution tables got up and advanced to confer in front of the bench, comparing sheets of paper. The man who had read the charges, obviously the chief prosecutor, made himself the spokesman. "Your Honor, Defense and prosecution wish to enter the following stipulations: that the decedent was a practicing politician within the meaning of the Constitution, that he met his death in the manner stated in the coroner's report, and that he was killed by the defendant Wilbur Whately. Is that agreeable to you, Mr. Vincent? The judge wanted to know. The defense answered affirmatively. I sat back, gaping like a fool. Why, that was practically, no, it was a confession. All right, gentlemen, the judge said. Now we have all that out of the way. Let's get on with the case. As though there were any case to get on with. I fully expected them to take it on from there in song, words by Gilbert and music by Sullivan. Well, Your Honor, we have a number of character witnesses. The prosecution. Prosecution, for God's sake, announced. Skip them, the defense said. We stipulate. But you can't stipulate character testimony, the prosecution argued. You don't know what our witnesses are going to testify to. Sure we do. They're going to give us a big, long, shaggy dog story about the life and miracles of St. Austin Maverick. We'll agree in advance to all that. This case is concerned only with his record as a politician, and as he spent the last 15 years in the Senate, that's all a matter of public record. I assume that the prosecution is going to introduce all that, too? Well, naturally, the prosecutor began, including his public acts on the last day of his life, the counsel for the defense demanded. His actions on the morning of May 7th as chairman of the Finance and Revenue Committee. You're going to introduce that as evidence for the prosecution? Well, now, the prosecutor began. Your Honor, we ask to have a certified copy of the proceedings of the Senate Finance and Revenue Committee for the morning of May 7, 2193, read into the record of this court. The counsel for the defense said, and thereafter, we rest our case. Has the prosecution anything to say before we close the court? Judge Nelson inquired. Well, Your Honor, this seems... That is, we ought to hear both sides of it. My old friend, Os Maverick, was really a fine man. He did a lot of good for the people of his continent. Yeah, we'd have lynched him when he got back, if somebody hadn't chopped him up here in New Austin. A voice from the rear of the courtroom broke in. The prosecution hemmed and hawed for a moment, and then announced in a hasty mumble that it rested. I will now close the court, Judge Nelson said. I advise everybody to keep your seats. I don't think it's going to be closed very long. And then he actually closed the court. Pressing a button on the bench, he raised a high black screen in front of him and his colleagues. It stayed up for some 60 seconds, and then dropped again. The Court of Political Justice has reached a verdict, he announced. Wilbur Whately and your attorney approach and hear the verdict. The defense lawyer motioned a young man who had been sitting beside him to rise. In the silence that had fallen, I could hear the defendant's boots squeaking as he went forward to hear his fate. The judge picked up a belt and a pair of pistols that had been lying in front of him. Wilbur Whately, he began, this court is proud to announce that you have been unanimously acquitted of the charge of political irresponsibility and of unjustified and excessive atrocity. There was one dissenting vote on acquitting you of the charge of political irresponsibility. One of the associate judges felt that the late unmitigated scoundrel Austin Maverick ought to have been skinned alive an inch at a time. You are, however, acquitted of that charge, too. You all know, he continued, addressing the entire assemblage, the reason for which this young hero cut down that monster of political iniquity as Austin Maverick. On the very morning of his justly merited death, Austin Maverick, using the powers of his political influence, rammed through the Finance and Federal Revenue Committee a bill entitled An Act for the Taxing of Personal Incomes and for the Levying of a Withholding Tax. Fellow citizens, words fail me to express my horror of this diabolic proposition, this proposed instrument of tyrannical extortion, borrowed from the dark ages of the 20th century. Why, if this young nobleman had not taken his blade in hand, I'd have killed the son of a bitch myself. He leaned forward, extending the belt and holsters to the defendant. I therefore restore to you your weapons, taken from you when, in compliance with the law, you were formerly arrested. Buckle them on, and, assuming your weapons again, go forth from this court a free man, Wilbur Whately, and take with you that machete with which you vindicated the liberties and rights of all New Texans. Bear it reverently to your home, hang it among your lairs and pennants, cherish it, and, dying, mention it within your will, bequeathing it as a rich legacy unto your issue. Court adjourned. Next session, 0900 tomorrow. For Christ's sake, let's get out of here before the barbecue's over. Some of the spectators, drooling for barbecued super cow, began crowding and jostling toward the exits. More of them were pushing to the front of the courtroom, cheering and waving their hip flasks. The prosecution and about half the friends of the court hastily left by a side door, probably to issue statements disassociating themselves from the deceased maverick. So that's the court that's going to try the man who killed Ambassador Cumshaw, I commented as Gale and I went out. Why, the purpose of that court seems to be to acquit murderers. Murderers? She was indignant. That wasn't murder. He just killed a politician. All the court could do was determine whether or not the politician needed it. And while I never heard about Maverick's income tax proposition, I can't see how they could have brought in any other kind of verdict. Of all the outrageous things. I was thoughtfully silent as we went out into the plaza, which was still a riot of noise and polychromatic costumes, and my thoughts were as weltered as the scene before me. Apparently, on New Texas, killing a politician wasn't regarded as malum in se, and was malum prohibitorum only to the extent that what happened to the politician was in excess of what he deserved. I began to understand why Palm was such a scared rabbit, why Hutchinson had that haunted look and kept his hands always within inches of his pistols. I began to feel more pity than contempt for Thrombley, too. He's been on this planet too long, and he should never have been sent here in the first place. I'll rotate him home as soon as possible. Then the full meaning of what I had seen finally got through to me. If they were going to try the killers of Cumshaw in that court, that meant that on New Texas, foreign diplomats were regarded as practicing politicians. That made me a practicing politician, too. And that's why, when we got back to the vicinity of the bandstand, I had my right hand close to my pistol, with my thumb on the inconspicuous little spot of silver inlay that operated the secret holster mechanism. I saw Hutchinson and Palm and Thrombley ahead. With them was a newcomer, a portly, ruddy-faced gentleman with a white mustache and goatee, dressed in a white suit. Gale broke away from me and ran toward him. This, I thought, would be her father. Now I would be introduced and find out just what her last name was. I followed more slowly, and saw a waiter with a wheeled serving table move in behind the group which he had joined. So I saw what none of them did. The waiter suddenly reversed his long carving knife and poised himself for a blow at President Hutchinson's back. I simply pressed the little silver stud on my belt. The creptata popped obediently out of the holster into my open hand. I thumbed off the safety and swung up. When my sights closed on the rising hand that held the knife, I fired. Haughty Ringo, who had been holding a sandwich with one hand and a drink with the other, dropped both and jumped on the man whose hand I had smashed. A couple of rangers closed in and grabbed him also. The group around President Hutchinson had all turned and were staring from me to the man I had shot, and from him to the knife with the broken handle lying on the ground. Hutchinson spoke first. "Well, Mr. Ambassador, my government thanks your government. That was nice shooting." "Hey, you been holding out on me," Hottie accused. "I never knew you was that kind of gunfighter." "There's a new wrinkle," the man with the white goatee said. "We'll have to screen the help at these affairs a little more closely." He turned to me. "Mr. Ambassador, New Texas owes you a great deal for saving the president's life. If you'll get that pistol out of your hand, I'd be proud to shake it, sir." I holstered my automatic and took his hand. Gale was saying, "Stephen, this is my father." And at the same time, Palm, the Secretary of State, was doing it more formally. "Ambassador Silk, may I present one of our leading citizens and large ranchers, Colonel Andrew Jackson Hickok." Dumbarton Oaks had taught me how to maintain the proper diplomat's unchanging expression. Drinking super bourbon had been a postgraduate course. I needed that training as I finally learned Gale's last name. End of chapter 5.